Truckers call it the dead stretch, a desolate highway where shadows seem alive and whispers follow you into the night. Jake Henderson, a pragmatic trucker, never believed in ghost stories until one night his rig stalled, and something unnatural came knocking. Stay tuned as we unravel his chilling encounter on the most haunted road in Texas. Truckers called it the dead stretch, a desolate, lonely 50-mile section of Highway 59 cutting through the deep woods of East Texas. The road was old, worn, and notorious among long-haul drivers for eerie occurrences and strange sightings. Jake Henderson, a veteran trucker, was a no-nonsense man. He didn't buy into ghost stories or local legends. His focus was on hauling loads, meeting deadlines, and paying bills. But one unforgettable night changed everything. Jake had picked up a load from Laredo, Texas, destined for Memphis. The quickest route took him straight through the dead stretch. Shrugging off the unease settling over him, Jake pressed on. He had driven that road before, but it always felt different. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive, and the shadows unnaturally long. As midnight approached, Jake reached the entrance to the dead stretch. His radio crackled with static and then cut out altogether. A quick glance at his dashboard confirmed he'd lost the signal. Now there was only the rumble of his rig's engine and the dull thudding of his heartbeat. No big deal, Jake muttered. He'd driven darker, lonelier roads in worse conditions. The trees lining the highway loomed like skeletal figures, their branches reaching skyward as if clawing for the heavens. Thick clouds obscured the moon, casting the landscape into an inky darkness. Even his headlights seemed swallowed by the night. Jake yawned, rubbing his eyes, and reached for his thermos. As he unscrewed the cap, something darted across the road. His hands jerked the wheel reflexively, causing the truck to swerve violently before he corrected it. What the hell was that? Jake muttered, his heart hammering. It wasn't a deer or a coyote. It was something else, something almost human in shape, but horribly twisted. Laughing nervously, he shook his head. You're just tired, Jake. Too many long nights. As the miles passed, the truck's rhythmic bounce on the cracked asphalt began to lull Jake into a sense of normalcy. But then, the temperature gauge spiked. A harsh red light blinked on his dashboard, demanding attention. Great. Just what I need, Jake grumbled. He pulled over, the massive rig groaning to a halt. The engine sputtered and died, leaving an eerie silence. Jake flipped on his CB radio. Breaker 19, this is Big Jake. Anyone out there? Static. Come on, someone's got to be out here. Breaker 19. The static stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. Jake froze, the sound sending a chill down his spine. It was faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakably a voice. Come back. Jake dropped the mic, his heart racing. Grabbing a flashlight, he shoved the door open and stepped into the cold night air. The stillness was suffocating. He popped the hood and waved the flashlight over the engine, though he knew he wouldn't find anything wrong. Then he heard a faint crunch of gravel. Slowly, he lowered the flashlight, its beam sweeping across the deserted highway. At the edge of the light stood a figure. Jake blinked, unsure if his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. The figure swayed gently side to side, like a marionette on unseen strings. Hey, Jake called, his voice echoing in the stillness. You all right? No response. Taking a hesitant step forward, Jake shined the flashlight directly on the figure. It froze. Jake's breath caught as he realized what he was looking at. The figure wasn't swaying, it was hanging. A man, suspended from a tree by a noose, his body limp and swaying gently in the sudden wind. Jake stumbled back, panic surging. He bolted to his truck, slammed the door, and locked it. His hands trembled as he jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and Jake floored the gas, speeding down the highway. In the rearview mirror, the figure was gone. For a moment, Jake thought he'd imagined the whole thing. But then the whisper returned louder now, emanating from the CB radio. "Come back." Jake's chest tightened. He glanced at the radio. It was turned off. Yet the whisper persisted, relentless, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. He slammed his fist into the radio, silencing it. Taking a deep breath, he tried to steady himself. But as he pressed on, a new horror unfolded. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, approaching fast. Relief washed over Jake. Another trucker, maybe. But as the lights drew closer, dread replaced his relief. It wasn't a truck. It was a rusted '67 Ford Fairlane, the very car his father had driven before dying in a crash Jake had witnessed as a child. The Fairlane barreled toward him. Jake swerved, narrowly avoiding a ditch. His truck screeched to a halt. When he looked back, the car was gone. Then his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number flashed on the screen. "You can't leave." Jake's blood turned cold. The whisper on the CB returned, echoing one last time, "Come back." The loneliest roads hide the darkest secrets, but nothing could prepare Nate Collins for the nightmare lurking in the fog. His 18-wheeler became a moving prison as an unseen terror hunted him through the dead of night. What waits in the mist? Stay tuned to uncover the truth if you dare. The midnight air was thick with fog as Nate Collins guided his 18-wheeler along a remote highway in northern Nevada. The rumble of the engine was the only sound on that long, empty stretch of road. There was a time when Nate enjoyed this part of the job, the freedom, the solitude, the endless blacktop stretching to the horizon. But tonight, something felt different. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive. Nate had been a trucker for over 15 years, hauling freight across every corner of the country. He was used to lonely nights, endless hours behind the wheel, and the occasional weird encounter, drunk stumbling onto the road, strange lights flickering in the sky. He always shrugged those off, chalking them up to exhaustion or coincidence. But lately, a creeping sense of dread had been gnawing at him. He couldn't explain it, but it had started about a week ago. He'd been driving late one night through Utah on a similarly desolate road when his radio crackled to life with static. Nate hadn't touched the thing in hours, and he didn't expect to hear anyone out there. But as he adjusted the volume, a low voice crackled through the static. "Turn back." The voice had been barely a whisper, almost drowned out by the static, but clear enough to make Nate's hair stand on end. He tried responding, asking who it was, but the voice didn't return. He turned the radio off, his hands trembling slightly on the wheel. He finished his run that night, but the unease lingered. It felt like someone or something had been warning him. Since then, the feeling of being watched had grown stronger. Every night, Nate felt like something was following him, keeping pace just beyond the edge of his headlights. He hadn't seen anything yet. But tonight, as he guided his truck through the fog, that presence felt closer than ever. The clock on his dashboard read 12:30 a.m. He was hours behind schedule. A massive storm had slowed him earlier in the night, and now the fog was making visibility nearly impossible. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror. Nothing but darkness. "Get it together, Collins," he muttered to himself. "You're just tired. It's all in your head." Even as he said it, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His headlights barely penetrated the wall of fog ahead, casting strange, shifting shadows along the road. The further he drove, the more the road seemed to disappear, swallowed by the dense mist. Up ahead, he saw something, a dim, flickering light on the side of the road. As he got closer, he realized it was a gas station, or what was left of one. The building looked abandoned, its windows shattered, the paint peeling from its walls. A single flickering light above the entrance was the only sign of life. Nate frowned. He didn't remember this place being here, and he'd driven this route plenty of times before. But there it was, sitting on the side of the highway like a relic from another time. A sense of unease settled over him. His instincts told him to keep driving, but he hadn't passed another stop in hours, and his fuel gauge was dipping dangerously low. Reluctantly, he pulled off the road and guided his truck into the gas station's empty lot. The engine rumbled to a stop, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The fog clung to the building, making it look even more sinister. Nate climbed out of the cab, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked toward the pump. He tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it was stronger now, like eyes were burning into the back of his neck. The pump was old, ancient even. The kind that hadn't been used in decades. Nate cursed under his breath as he realized there was no way this thing would work. He was about to turn back to his truck when he heard a faint creak, like the sound of a door opening slowly behind him. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. Slowly he turned toward the gas station. The front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. But the night was still, there was no wind. Nate's skin prickled with goosebumps. "Don't go inside," a voice whispered in his mind. But his feet moved anyway. The door creaked louder as he approached, the darkness inside the building seeming to swallow all light. Nate hesitated at the threshold, peering into the black void beyond. The flickering light above the door cast long shadows across the floor. He stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew hit him hard. The shelves were empty, long abandoned, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of grime. Nate shined his flashlight around the room, his heart pounding louder with each passing second. Then he saw a figure standing in the far corner of the store, shrouded in shadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its head was clocked at an unnatural angle, like it had been broken. Nate's breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly turned toward him. It had no face. Nate stumbled backward, crashing into a shelf as the faceless figure took a step forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. The flashlight flickered in his hand, casting erratic beams of light around the room. He fumbled for the door, his heart pounding in his ears. Suddenly, the radio in his truck crackled to life. The same voice from before whispered through the static. "Turn back. Turn back." Nate's blood ran cold. He bolted for the door, his boots slipping on the grimy floor. He burst out into the fog, running toward his truck. Heavy footsteps followed behind him, slow but steady, growing closer with each passing second. He threw himself into the cab and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. His breath came in ragged gasps as he jammed the keys into the ignition and floored the gas pedal. The truck roared to life, its tires screeching as it tore out of the lot and back onto the highway. For a moment, Nate allowed himself to believe he'd escaped. He glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but fog, but the figure was there, It stood in the middle of the road, just barely visible through the mist, watching him. And then it started to move slowly but deliberately. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. Nate's heart hammered in his chest as he pressed the accelerator to the floor, the truck roaring down the highway. But no matter how fast he went, the figure kept pace, always just behind him, a shadow in the fog growing closer and closer. The radio crackled again. The voice whispered, "You can't outrun him." A routine haul through the desert takes a chilling turn when veteran trucker Eddie Malone encounters headlights that defy reason and whispers that refuse to stay silent. What happens when you're hunted by the unknown? This is a story you'll never forget. Eddie Malone had been on the road for nearly 20 years. He'd seen it all from freak snowstorms in the Rockies to tornadoes whipping across the flatlands of Kansas. Eddie prided himself on being a man of logic, someone who didn't believe in ghosts or superstitions. But one fateful night, the kind that began like any other long haul, would shake his beliefs to the core. It was the dead of night on Interstate 40, slicing through the desolate New Mexico desert. The air was dry, and the stillness pressed in on Eddie like a heavy blanket. His 18-wheeler's headlights cut through the darkness, their beams flickering now and then, as if the desert itself were trying to snuff them out. Eddie yawned, gripping his thermos. The strong, bitter coffee inside was the only thing keeping him from pulling over and calling it a night. The delivery had to be made by morning, no excuses. That meant no stopping until he reached Flagstaff. The CB radio crackled faintly in the background, but for the last hour, it had been nothing but white noise and distant, unintelligible chatter. Searching for a distraction, Eddie flipped the dial, hoping to find music, anything to break the monotony of the endless highway. The stars twinkled brightly above, but their brilliance only made the vast emptiness around him feel more isolated. No towns, no other vehicles, no signs of life. It was just Eddie, the road, and the desert stretching endlessly in every direction. Then he saw the lights. At first, Eddie thought it was another truck coming up fast behind him, bright headlights cutting through the night. But as they drew closer, he realized something was off. The lights were too high, too wide. They didn't belong to any vehicle Eddie had ever seen. Leaning forward, he squinted at his mirrors, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then, just as quickly as they appeared, the lights vanished. Eddie shook his head, chuckling nervously. "You're just tired," he muttered, convincing himself it was a trick of the eye. Glancing at the dashboard, he noted the time 2:18 a.m. Just a few more hours, he reassured himself, gripping the wheel tighter. But a few miles down the road, the lights returned. This time they weren't behind him, they were in front of him, floating above the road. Two bright orbs shimmered in the desert air, casting an eerie glow. Eddie's heart began to race. He slowed the truck, unsure of what he was seeing. The lights hovered, motionless, as if waiting for him. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the engine. He reached for the CB mic, but before he could key it, the radio crackled to life. A garbled, distorted voice broke through the static. "Breaker. Breaker." Eddie froze, his hand hovering over the mic. The voice was faint, but there was no mistaking the desperation in its tone. "Anyone out there?" the voice asked, barely audible. "This is Big Rig, Eddie," he replied. His voice steady despite the chill creeping down his spine. "You all right out there?" Silence. The only sound was the hum of his engine and the faint crackle of static. He waited a moment longer before setting the mic down, his eyes darting between the road and the CB. The lights ahead flickered, glowing brighter for a brief second before fading into the dark desert sky. Eddie pressed the gas pedal, determined to leave the strange lights behind. But as his truck rumbled forward, the radio crackled again. Big Rig Eddie. His blood ran cold. His name. The voice on the radio had said his name. He hadn't broadcast his handle tonight, hadn't mentioned it to anyone. His heart pounded as he snatched up the mic. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "How do you know my name?" Static filled the cab, followed by an unsettling pause. Then, the voice returned low, distorted, and calm. "You see it yet?" Eddie slammed the mic down, fear coursing through him. His eyes darted to the road ahead, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. The lights had vanished, but the unease lingered. He pressed the accelerator harder, the truck picking up speed. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. The lights were back, but this time they weren't in front or behind him. They were beside him, floating effortlessly alongside the truck. Eddie turned his head, his breath hitching in his throat. The lights were impossibly close, keeping pace with his rig, their glow bright and unnatural. His hands trembled on the wheel. "This isn't real," he whispered, trying to convince himself. "This can't be real." The voice came again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the CB. It was inside the cab, echoing around him, as if the truck itself were speaking. "Pull over, Eddie." "No way in hell," Eddie shouted, his voice filled with panic. He pressed the gas pedal to the floor, the engine roaring as the truck sped down the highway. The lights didn't fall back. They didn't falter. They stayed with him, glowing brighter with each passing second. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights vanished. The highway stretched out before him, empty and quiet. The desert was still, the moonlight casting an eerie glow across the barren landscape. Eddie eased off the gas, his breathing ragged. "Just the desert playing tricks on me," he muttered, though he didn't believe his own words. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the lights again. Instead, he saw something far worse. A figure stood in the middle of the road, directly in his path. Eddie's heart stopped. The figure was tall and thin, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that obscured its face. It stood motionless, its shadow stretching long across the asphalt. Eddie slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding violently as he fought to maintain control. The massive vehicle shuddered to a halt, its front bumper mere inches from the figure. But the man didn't move. He just stood there, silent and still. Rolling down his window, Eddie shouted, "Hey, you all right?" No response. Eddie's skin prickled with unease. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to drive away, but he was frozen in place, his eyes locked on the figure. Slowly the man lifted his head. The brim of his hat tilted back, revealing a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through Eddie's very soul. The figure's lips parted, and in a voice like gravel grinding against metal, it whispered, "You should have pulled over." Eddie's breath caught as the figure began to move, gliding toward the truck. The radio crackled to life one last time, the same voice whispering in a haunting tone, "Time to go, Eddie." Highway 95 has seen its share of strange tales, but none as chilling as the night Tom Harris picked up a hitchhiker who wasn't what she seemed. The deeper into the darkness they drove. the more the truth unraveled until escape became impossible. Stay with us as we uncover what really happened that night. It was a moonless night on Highway 95, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow everything whole. Tom Big Rig Harris had been driving for hours, the steady hum of his 18-wheeler lulling him into a focused rhythm. The night was quiet, almost too quiet, and the barren Nevada desert stretched endlessly on either side of the highway. Tom was no stranger to the road or its eerie tales. He'd heard plenty of ghost stories from other truckers about haunted highways and spectral hitchhikers, but he never paid them much attention. Logic ruled his life, and as far as he was concerned, the road was just the road. But this night would be different. This night would test everything he believed. His CB radio crackled, the static loud enough to pull him from his thoughts. A faint, urgent voice came through, distorted but clear enough to make him pause. "Attention all drivers, beware the hitchhiker on Highway 95. She's dangerous. Stay away." Tom frowned, glancing at the radio. It wasn't uncommon for truckers to swap stories to keep each other entertained, but something about the voice sent a chill down his spine. He shrugged it off, chalking it up to a prank or someone trying to spook drivers. Still, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that crept over him. A few miles later, he spotted something or someone standing on the side of the road. It was a woman, dressed in white, her long hair tangled and blowing in the wind. She looked out of place, lost and vulnerable in the harsh desert night. Against his better judgment, Tom slowed down. His headlights illuminated her pale face as she turned toward him, raising a hand in a desperate wave. Her wide, pleading eyes met his, and he hesitated for a moment before pulling over. "Need a ride?" Tom called out, leaning slightly out of his window. The woman nodded, her voice trembling as she approached. "Please, I need help." Tom opened the door, motioning for her to climb in. "Where are you headed?" "Just drive," she said quickly, her eyes darting nervously toward the darkness behind her. Tom's brow furrowed, but he didn't press her further. He eased the truck back onto the highway, the massive vehicle rumbling into motion. The silence in the cab was thick, broken only by the low hum of the engine. After a few minutes, Tom decided to break the tension. "So what's your name?" "Anna," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "What were you doing out there all alone?" he asked, glancing at her briefly before focusing back on the road. Anna hesitated before answering. "I shouldn't have stopped. I didn't realize what she was until it was too late." Tom felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What do you mean? Who's she?" Anna's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the seat. "The hitchhiker," she whispered, her voice shaking. "She wants to take me back. I can feel her. She's close." Tom tightened his grip on the steering wheel, trying to ignore the growing unease settling in his chest. "It's just a story," he said, more to himself than to her. "There's no such thing as a ghostly hitchhiker." Anna didn't respond. She simply stared out the window, her expression haunted. The atmosphere in the cab grew heavier, the air colder. Tom couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following them. For a moment he thought he saw a shadow flicker at the edge of his vision, but when he looked again, there was nothing there. Suddenly the truck's engine sputtered, and the headlights dimmed. "No, no, no," Tom muttered, slamming his foot on the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, but struggled to maintain speed. "Keep driving," Anna screamed, her voice filled with panic. "I'm trying," Tom shouted back. his heart racing as he fought with the controls. The truck's lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows across the desert road. And then, just ahead in the beam of the headlights, Tom saw her. The figure stood in the middle of the highway, a translucent woman dressed in white. Her hair flowed unnaturally, like smoke in the wind, and her face was wrong. Hollow eyes stared straight at Tom, and her lips curled into an unnatural smile. "That's her," Anna shrieked, clutching the dashboard. Tom's breath hitched. He gripped the wheel tightly, swerving to avoid the figure. The truck veered off the road, narrowly missing her, and came to a screeching halt on the shoulder. For a moment, everything was silent. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the empty road ahead. "She's gone," he said, trying to catch his breath. "No," Anna whispered, her voice trembling. "She's never gone." Before Tom could process her words, the door on the passenger side swung open violently. A bone-chilling wind rushed into the cab, and Anna let out a blood-curdling scream as she was pulled out into the darkness. "Anna," Tom shouted, fumbling with his seatbelt. He threw open his door and jumped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. The fog had grown thicker, swirling around the truck like a living thing. He could barely see a few feet in front of him, but he could hear Anna's cries. "Help me." Her voice echoed distant and desperate. Tom ran into the mist, his heart pounding with fear. "Anna, where are you?" Suddenly the fog parted, and there she was, the hitchhiker. She stood motionless, her hollow eyes fixed on Tom. In her arms, she cradled Anna like a lifeless doll. "Let her go," Tom demanded, his voice trembling. The hitchhiker tilted her head, a sickening smile spreading across her face. "You can join her," she said, her voice cold and echoing. Tom took a step back, his mind racing. He turned and bolted for the truck, his breath ragged as he scrambled back into the cab. Slamming the door shut, he locked it and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, but the radio crackled with static. The same distorted voice from earlier whispered through the speakers. "You can't leave." Tom floored the gas, the tires screeching as the truck barreled down the highway. He didn't dare look back, but in the rearview mirror, he could see her, the hitchhiker, floating after him, her pale figure glowing in the fog. The voice on the radio grew louder, relentless. "You can't escape. You'll never escape." Tom's hands shook as he gripped the wheel, his eyes locked on the road ahead. He drove through the night, the hitchhiker's presence looming in his mind, her whispers echoing in his ears. When the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, the fog began to lift. The highway stretched out before him, empty and quiet. Tom finally exhaled, his body trembling with exhaustion. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, he saw her standing in the middle of the road, watching, waiting. He knew then that he'd never truly leave her behind. One wrong turn on a lonely highway, and trucker Mike Thompson's life spirals into a nightmarish encounter. A mysterious gas station, an abandoned cabin, and a shadowy figure that stalks the woods. This isn't just another drive. Will Mike survive the night? Or will he become part of the legend? Stay with us till the end to uncover the chilling truth. It was a moonless night on Highway 95, the kind of darkness that seemed to devour everything it touched. Mike Thompson, known as Road King among his fellow truckers, was hauling a load of steel across the empty Nevada desert. The familiar hum of his 18-wheeler's engine usually kept him company, but tonight it felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a suffocating silence that even the truck couldn't drown out. Mike glanced at the clock. Midnight. He had been driving for hours, and the barren landscape outside offered no distractions, just an endless stretch of road flanked by dark, lifeless desert. The CB radio crackled softly in the background, breaking the oppressive stillness. A voice suddenly cut through the static. "Breaker. Breaker. Any truckers out there?" Mike leaned forward, adjusting the volume. "This is Road King," he said, his tone casual. "What's your 20?" The reply was faint, distorted, and unsettling. "Be careful out there tonight. The shadow. It's hunting." Mike frowned, his grip on the wheel tightening. "What are you talking about?" he asked. But the radio fell silent, leaving only static. He shook his head, brushing it off as a prank or a tired trucker's rambling. Still, he couldn't ignore the chill that ran down his spine. Miles later, the headlights of his rig caught something ahead, a dimly lit gas station, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. Mike slowed down, his brows furrowed. He didn't remember seeing a station here before, and he had driven this route dozens of times. The building looked ancient, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. The single pump outside was rusted and unused. Despite his unease, Mike decided to pull in. His fuel gauge was low and he hadn't seen another stop for hours. As he stepped out of the cab, the cold night air hit him like a slap. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the pump, which looked older up close, too old to work. Mike cursed under his breath, annoyed at the wasted stop, and turned to head back to his truck. That's when he heard it. A faint creak, like the sound of a door opening. Mike froze, his heart hammering in his chest. Slowly, he turned toward the gas station. The front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the still air. There was no wind, yet the door moved as if beckoning him inside. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the quiet. No response. Against his better judgment, Mike took a step toward the station. The flickering light above the door cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and shift as he moved closer. He hesitated at the threshold, peering into the darkness beyond the doorway. The air inside was stale, heavy with the smell of mildew and dust. The shelves were empty, their contents long gone, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of grime. Mike shined his flashlight around the room, his breath visible in the cold air. Then he saw a figure in the far corner. It was tall, impossibly so, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it had been broken. The figure didn't move, but Mike could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, even though its face was obscured by shadows. A surge of panic gripped him. He stumbled backward, knocking into a shelf, the clattering sound breaking the silence. The figure began to move, its motion slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Mike bolted for the door, his flashlight flickering in his shaking hand. He burst outside, the cold night air filling his lungs as he sprinted back to his truck. His boots slipped on the gravel, but he didn't stop until he was safely inside the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it. His hands trembled as he jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, but the relief was short-lived. The CB radio crackled again, the same distorted voice cutting through the static. "Too late now, Road King." Mike's blood ran cold. He floored the gas pedal, the truck lurching forward onto the highway. His headlights cut through the darkness, but the shadows seemed to grow thicker, almost alive, as they followed him. In the rearview mirror, he saw movement shapes shifting in the fog, keeping pace with his rig. His heart pounded as he pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine groaning under the strain. Just as he thought he was putting distance between himself and the nightmare, the truck's headlights illuminated something ahead, a cabin, sitting just off the road. It looked abandoned, its windows shattered, and its wooden frame weathered by time. Mike had no intention of stopping, but as he approached, the truck's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging him into complete darkness. "Damn it," he shouted, slamming his fists against the steering wheel. The silence was deafening. Even the usual hum of the desert night was absent. Then, faintly at first, he heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel outside. Mike grabbed his flashlight and opened the door cautiously, stepping out into the pitch-black night. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as he scanned the area, the flashlight's beam cutting through the fog. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. No answer. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Mike backed away from the truck, his flashlight darting from side to side. The beam landed on the cabin's door, which was now wide open. "Don't go inside," a voice whispered in his mind. But he couldn't stop himself. His legs moved as if controlled by something else, carrying him toward the open doorway. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness inside the cabin seemed to pulse, alive and waiting. Mike stepped inside, his flashlight flickering. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center. On it sat a hat, wide-brimmed and old-fashioned, like something out of another era. Then the door slammed shut behind him. The flashlight went out, and the whispers began. "You can't escape, Mike." When Jack Reynolds took his rig down California's Highway 37, he thought it would be just another night behind the wheel. But the chilling whispers on the radio and the sinister figure standing in the middle of the road told a different story. What happens when the road becomes your enemy? Stay tuned to uncover the terror waiting ahead. On a stretch of Highway 37, where the stars barely pierced the heavy veil of night, Jack Iron Horse Reynolds gripped the wheel of his 18-wheeler. The hum of the engine was a familiar lullaby, but tonight, an unsettling tension filled the air. Jack had been on the road for over 10 hours, and fatigue clung to him like a second skin as he navigated the winding road through the hills of California. Flipping on the radio, Jack hoped for some music or chatter to keep him alert. The static crackled before a distorted voice broke through. "Attention all truckers on Highway 37. There's been strange reports of a phantom hitchhiker. Stay alert." Jack chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "Just another ghost story," he muttered. Truckers loved to spin tales about haunted roads, but he never put stock in them. He'd been driving too long to let stories mess with his head. Yet, a faint chill crept up his spine as the voice faded, leaving the cab in eerie silence. A few miles down the road, headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. They grew larger, brighter, and closer. A sleek, black pickup was tailing him too closely for comfort. Jack tightened his grip on the wheel, irritation bubbling up. "What's this jerk's problem?" he muttered under his breath. The pickup swerved to the side, pulling up alongside his rig. Jack glanced over, his annoyance shifting to unease. The driver, a young man with wild eyes, was gesturing frantically for Jack to stop. Jack rolled down his window slightly, shouting, "What's wrong?" "Get off this road. You have to get off now." The man screamed, panic etched on his face. "Why?" Jack asked, his confusion mounting. "The hitchhiker. She's real. Get away before it's too late," the man yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. Before Jack could respond, the pickup sped off into the night, its taillights vanishing into the darkness. "What the hell was that about?" Jack muttered, shaking his head. He tried to dismiss the encounter, but a sense of unease settled over him like a heavy weight. Minutes later, he saw her. A figure stood by the side of the road, illuminated by his headlights. It was a woman dressed in white, her long hair flowing in the gentle breeze. She looked fragile, lost, and out of place. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he slowed the truck, curiosity overriding his better judgment. As he drew closer, the woman raised her hand, signaling for him to stop. Jack hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to keep driving, but the look in her eyes, wide, pleading, and desperate, convinced him to pull over. "Need a lift?" Jack called out, leaning out of the window. The woman stepped closer, her pale face now fully illuminated by the truck's headlights. "Please, I need to get away from here," she said, her voice trembling. Jack frowned, sensing something off. "Where are you headed?" "Just drive." "Please," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Against his better judgment, Jack nodded. "All right, hop in." The woman climbed into the cab, and Jack guided the rig back onto the highway. The silence in the cab was heavy, broken only by the low rumble of the engine. Jack couldn't help but glance at her occasionally. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap, and her eyes darted nervously toward the window. "So what's your name?" Jack asked, trying to lighten the mood. "Emily," she replied softly, still staring out at the darkness. "What were you doing out here alone?" he pressed. Emily hesitated before answering. "I shouldn't have stopped. I thought I was helping someone, but it wasn't human." Jack's grip on the wheel tightened. "What do you mean? What did you see?" Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. "The hitchhiker. She lures people in, and then she takes them." Jack let out a shaky laugh, trying to mask his growing unease. "You've been listening to too many ghost stories." Emily didn't respond. Her silence spoke volumes. The road stretched on, darker and more oppressive with every passing mile. Jack couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following them. Suddenly, the engine sputtered and the headlights flickered. "Come on." "Not now," Jack muttered, his heart pounding. "Don't stop," Emily screamed, her voice laced with terror. "I don't have a choice," Jack shouted back, wrestling with the controls. The truck shuddered to a halt, the engine dead, leaving them in suffocating darkness. Jack reached for his flashlight, his breath visible in the now freezing air. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered. "She's here," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Jack turned to look at her, but her gaze was fixed ahead. Following her line of sight, he saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the road, illuminated by the faint moonlight breaking through the clouds. The woman was dressed in white, her hair flowing unnaturally, as if caught in an invisible wind. But her face was wrong. Hollow eyes stared back at Jack, and her mouth twisted into a chilling smile. "That's her," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. Jack's heart raced. The figure began to move toward the truck, gliding rather than walking. "Stay here," Jack said, his voice shaking as he opened the door and stepped out. "What are you doing?" Emily cried, grabbing his arm. "I'll handle this," Jack said, though every fiber of his being told him to run. As he stepped onto the asphalt, the air grew colder. The figure stopped just a few feet away, her empty eyes boring into him. "What do you want?" Jack demanded, his voice trembling. The woman tilted her head, her smile widening. "You should have kept driving," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. Suddenly, the ground beneath Jack's feet seemed to shift. Shadows rose from the asphalt, swirling around him like a living thing. He stumbled back, his flashlight flickering wildly as the shadows closed in. "Get back in the truck," Emily screamed from inside. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted for the cab, slamming the door shut behind him. His hands shook as he jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and Jack floored the gas, the truck lurching forward. In the rearview mirror, he saw her. The hitchhiker stood motionless in the middle of the road, her smile hauntingly wide. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and waved. Jack didn't stop driving until the sun broke over the horizon. Even then, he couldn't shake the image of her hollow eyes and twisted grin. Somewhere out there, on the desolate stretch of Highway 37, she was still waiting for the next driver who wouldn't listen to the warnings.